moment. You don't have to raise your hand, right? When you had time is kind of what it came out to be. And holidays were a big time for Jesus, right? I mean, we prayed to Jesus at Thanksgiving, and Christmas worked out really well. We had to show up for that because it was Jesus' birthday, right? And then I had some people in my church who would argue that we weren't allowed to talk about it because we didn't know when Jesus was born. That's a lie, right? Okay, so let's never talk about Jesus being born. That's a good option. You see, we talk about that. We were taught maybe growing up that there is something about mediocrity. Is that all we are called to is a little more than nothing. It's not just enough to be called something. In other words, what we say is we're called to just stay above the bar. Just to have a kind of a relationship with Jesus, but not really called to something major, just to exist. This is really important for leaders to understand. When we lessen biblical expectations for ourselves, we will reap what we sow. I want you to hear that. If Moses goes to the people later and says, well, God kind of told me this, but you don't have to. It's really okay. I mean, you can choose, and God will always let you choose, but the truth is, it's like, it might have been God. Nah, I might have drank something heavy that day. He doesn't do that. And why? Is because he says that when this happens, and when we go where God calls us, forward takes place. Peter Drucker, he puts it this way: leadership is lifting a person's vision to high heights, the raising of a person's performance to a higher standard, the building of a personality beyond its own limitations. Moses needed vision. He needed vision to go forward. And who did that come from? God. God himself. You see, a couple months ago, I shared with some guys in the email that I felt like I needed to start a men's reading group. Now, it sounds weird because it sounds like an old person book club, okay? Like, it's not that. Like, I'm not against book clubs, but I've never been part of a book club because I don't read romance novels, okay? That's why I didn't do that. But I decided, I want to get some guys together and just read about leadership. Like, what does it look like? I mean, we all can learn from somewhere and something. Everyone leads in some realm, somehow, in some way. And so I decided, I'm going to get some guys together. We're going to read some leadership books together and just discuss and talk through this and pray through it and see what Scripture has to say and bounce it off. And the reason I felt convicted about this is because I think there was a great chasm in the Big C church of old of really raising up leaders, like helping understand what it means to be more like Moses. And then we started doing this last month, and it was a great experience. It was awesome. It was wonderful. I do have to tell you this, though. I was a little leery of just putting out there to everyone because I wanted to make sure that the people the men who chose to be a part of it, like really got it and desired to grow as a man of God. And then I realized something. That was me controlling it. Does that make sense? That was Nate making it what he kind of wants. I mean, it's a God thing, but I'm going to put my twist on it. And so this morning I throw it out there to you guys. We're all men. We're only 1 month in. You didn't miss a whole lot. You could read a book. The only qualifications to be a part of it you have to have is you're willing to read a book a month, right? And implement it into your life. That's it. And so I put it out there to you that maybe there's some of you that would benefit from that. I want to throw it out there. Email me, call me, let me know. We meet again at the beginning of December. As we look at what does it mean to lead, what does it mean to put God at the highest and not settle for mediocrity. You see, God, I want us to hear this morning for some of you to go, I'm just not really cut out for this. I'm not cut out for what Moses was that God was asking of Moses. I want you to know that God will use you right where you're at if you say yes. God uses you right where you're at. For some, I mean, we think of Moses, it was Egypt, but for the teenage boy in Topeka, maybe it's his sports team. It's his hallway where the lockers are at, right? God will use you the way He wants to use you in moving forward if you say yes. For maybe it's a lady who's a widow living in a retirement facility now. You know what the greatest need in a retirement facility is? Just to say hi. It's a lonely place for some people who especially were married and now their spouse has passed away. God will use you right where you're at. And then what about the factory worker in the break room? I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a factory before. I did when we first got married. The break room is where everyone comes and says how the boss can do it better. Did you know that? It's where you get together and everyone brings their lunch and they talk about how broken the line is and we're not going to get out on time and how if the shift managers did it a little bit differently. God can use you right where you're at if you just say yes. And parents, I want to give you this encouragement. Your children need you to say yes. And this is what I found out just talking to a young man this week. They have a young little boy. And it's kind of a little awkward when you have just a young little one because they really don't have friends yet. Your kids don't have friends, you know what I mean? So you find yourself hanging out with your family and yourself a lot. And I said, just wait till your kid gets in school. Like the realm of influence blows open wide. My daughter comes home and she has phone numbers of her friends and her parents said yes and the ins and outs. The door is blown open even by third grade, fourth grade, second grade, kindergarten. Your realm of influence does not just end up being your children, it ends up being your children's friends and even their friends' parents. And why? Because God says that He will use you right where you're at, just like Moses. See, Moses begins to come to grips with expecting God's call of moving forward in his life. We see it in verse 18. It says, then Moses went back to Jethro. Remember Jethro? He's the father-in-law with the funny name, right? He goes back to Jethro, and he says to him, let me return to my own people in Egypt and to see if any of them are still alive. Jethro said, go, and I wish you well. We all need someone to champion our leading. We all need someone to champion and say yes to us stepping out. What a great opportunity. Remember Jethro, he worked for Jethro, right? He worked for Jethro. And he says, I need to leave the sheep out there and go back to where God's calling me to go. Ministry acquaintance of mine, he had a staff person come to him a few years ago. This guy was in his late 20s. His mom and dad were divorced when he was about 14, 15 years old. He had a broken relationship with his dad for many years, and over the last couple of years, he started building a relationship with his dad again. All of a sudden, he found out that his dad was living in Colorado, and he was stricken with cancer. And he came to the ministry acquaintance of mine and just said, you know what, I just want to let you know, I think I'm going to resign. And naturally, he's like, oh, great, right? He says, no, I'm going to resign. I think God is asking me to go move to live with my dad and serve him and care for him. The scripture says, honor your father and mother. He says, I'm going to do that. And the ministry acquaintance said, you know what, I'm not going to let you resign. We're just going to let you be gone. And you come back when you are done doing what God has asked you to do. Sometimes we need someone to champion our leading. See, God always provides when we move forward. Moses says, we see in verse 19, that God goes on to tell him that, you know what, there are people who are dead. Those people who wanted you dead are already dead. So what happens is Moses doesn't just go like on a short little vacation. He doesn't just go a little bit and kind of do a sightseeing deal, right? It says he packs his wives and his family and goes. See, there's something we can learn from that, is that when God calls us to move forward and God calls us to go, He doesn't say, go check it out. He's wanting us to jump in with 2 feet and trust that the provision will come from Him. See, there's something about family within Scripture continually. It starts with Abraham, and even the disciples had to make this tough choice. They had to choose and say, leave your families and come follow me and be fishers of men. Moses was blessed to take them with. You see, this morning, church, I'll give you this take home. God is asking, I believe this, God is asking something big of some of the leaders in this church. All the leaders in this church. And I believe that. And we see it happening. And I believe God has called the big things of this church, of you sitting here, and people who are not sitting here, and people who have yet to sit here. But the question always is that God calls big. Do you get this? I believe God calls big of many churches, many bodies of fellowship, many bodies of believers. But you know why there's some who don't do big things? Because they just stood and gazed at the burning bush. They didn't listen to what God was saying. I go to different conferences or talk with pastors, and there would be the guy who says, you know what, the church just isn't growing. We're not reaching lost people. People in the church don't want to do anything. They don't care about God. And I used to be like, I'll be honest with you, when I was younger, I know it's tough to think I was younger, I get that, but when I was younger, I used to say this, amen, right? Yeah, broken people. But guess what it is? It's not just that we're broken. It's that when the movement of God happens, the question we have to ask, will we stifle it? Will we stop it? Will we lean in closely and listen to what God is saying in that burning bush? See, we have to ask the question, when that time comes for big movement, will we allow him to lead? And how will we follow God? I just pose it with this. Will we be merely marveled at a burning bush, or will we lean in to hear the true voice of God? I love how in chapter 7, verse 7, way ahead. I never really looked at this real intently. But when I think of a guy being a shepherd out there, I think kind of the young, brash, crass kind of guy doing his deal. This is what chapter 7, verse 7 says. In verse 6 says, Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. He was 80 and 83. Now some of you go, well, how'd they get there? Like with a walker? Like, how'd that work? You know how they got there? They got there with the mission and the vision of God. You see, church, as the band comes, they close with this. This weekend, I've been manning it with the 2 younger kids at home all by myself, all right? I just want you to see our kids downstairs. They were dressed, they matched, boogers were not in the face, all right? And they ate breakfast, and we got in the car and made it here, okay? That's a win for Dad. That's a win. I used to say babysitting my kids, horrible thing to say, okay? Especially when your wife's a homemaker, all right? Dads don't babysit, we dad, okay? We parent. Last night as I was getting ready to put the kids down, and they're getting ready to go to bed, the littlest one, she goes to bed quickly and does her thing. Now little guy on the other hand, he has his own opinions these days. I don't know where he's formulating these, but we're working through it, right? And he says to me last night, he kind of got a little snippy, you know, where they talk back to you. That's not supposed to happen for a while, but it's happening now. And I said, Bud, who's Dad? He says, well, I'll be Dad. And you can be son. And I said, no, Bud, I'm Dad and you're son. I said, let's not argue. He says, this is what he said, but what if I'm smart about it? In other words, what if I actually know what I'm talking about? And in that moment, we just tucked him with his covers, right? We said our prayers, and I walked out quickly out of his room. But I thought to myself, is that not what we do with God when he moves sometimes? Is God, I know you're God. But what if I'm God just for a few seconds? I mean, what if I actually know what I'm talking about? What if the collection of your people at Countryside know better than you what it is that you need from us? What if the sermon you want me to preach tomorrow, really, I see what Scripture says, but did you mean that? Not everyone wants to hear that. You see, church, I share this with you. If we're going to move forward with God, you got to be all in. Otherwise, we end up looking at a bush that's burning, and we never hear the voice of God. You stand with us this morning.